Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
So $1 trillion in federal funding, congressional representation, and emergency planning across the country in a time of catastrophic climate change. These are just three of the many, many components of the U.S. Census, and one of the three of the reasons why it's such a critical issue for this country. I want to start with you, Terri. This is a really smart audience that I think will understand much better than most that you speak to just why the census is so critical and so foundational. But give us a full sense of why it is such an important civic project.
Well, thank you, Derek. And by the way, I do want to thank the sponsors because for recognizing the import of this issue to cities. I see Bloomberg Philanthropies Census Warrior Rose Gilhern here. So thank you. She's been working with cities across the country to mobilize. But as you said, the census is foundational. And it is a guide star, I think, for so much of what we do in this country. It is the foundation of our democracy and the promise of equal representation through apportionment and redistricting, not just in Congress, but in state legislatures, city councils, school boards. As you said, it guides more than $1 trillion, but that's every year, directly or indirectly, to cities, states, and households. And it is again, the guide star for planning and prudent investment of resources, both by government, but also by the private sector, by businesses.
Mayor, give us a sense, this is a beautiful explanation of why census matters at a 10,000-foot level. On the ground in Providence, give us a sense of how you find census data to be absolutely critical to the maintenance and functioning of your city.
Sure. Thank you, Derek. And I also want to thank all of the sponsors for prioritizing this and giving us a platform to talk about it, to help get the message out. So it's critical to the work that we do in our cities. And a lot has been said about the lack of federal leadership and partnership to cities over the past several years. But we still, nonetheless, rely on strong federal partners. And whether it's federal formula dollars, such as Title II, or CDBG dollars, we're facing significant, severe challenges in our cities, and we need to marshal all of the resources that we have. So if we're concerned about the education that our kids are getting and whether they're being prepared for the challenges of the future, that's how we use our Title II dollars with education. So we can bridge the gap between the rich and poor and make sure that our kids are receiving top-notch education. We rely on these funds. But it's also things such as addressing the homelessness challenge, whether it's home funds, CDBG funds. These are the dollars that we put on the streets to create new units of housing to make sure we get folks off the street and into supportive and stable housing. Essentially, everything that we work on and everything that we do at the city level, we rely on our partners at the federal level. And for all of these reasons, it's important that we get this complete count right and counted so we commit the resources that are required to face these really significant challenges.
Yeah, the project of counting 330 million people, 340-some million people, it is a Herculean challenge. Like, as an individual sitting at my desk writing about the news, it is almost impossible for me to imagine how this is accomplished. And the fact is that it's not always accomplished perfectly. There is a historical disproportionate undercount of urban populations, of rural poor populations, even, as you said backstage, of young children in America. Terri, give us a sense of why it's so difficult to count properly in some places and count properly within some populations, and how we can start to think about getting smarter about this.
Yes, so you're right. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that I think the Census Bureau does the best it can with the resources it is given. Yeah. And it is made up primarily of professional civil servants. But the census is not an equal opportunity enumeration. It does not count all communities, all population groups equally well. And so historically, it has missed disproportionate numbers of people of color, as you said, of young children, especially Black and Latino children.
You're getting some intervention. There you go.
Something wrong
Thank you
with
very
the
much.
technology. Black and Latino children and low-income households and so forth. There are a number of challenges. Every census has its challenges. Every census has its controversies. I am particularly worried that the 2020 census is facing a set of unprecedented challenges that could thwart the success of this census. Let me just tick them off very quickly. Please. At a very high level. I mean, the Census Bureau has not had sufficient or timely resources for much of this decade. This is the first high-tech census. We all agree we have to modernize the process, but technology brings risks, real and perceived. I often say, Russia, we hope you're not listening. And a subset of that, of course, is a major challenge. I think cities have to be vigilant about this, disinformation campaigns that will affect not just the election, but the census as well. There is a climate of fear, that started before the last presidential election. It drove millions of people into the shadows. And that was before the citizenship question controversy. I'm worried about natural disasters. I call it climate change meets the census. And I think lastly, we have to just remember, this census is going to be conducted in the cacophony of what's going to be probably a very nasty, I can't think of a better word, presidential campaign. And the Census Bureau has to be heard to get its message out above that noise, and that's going to be difficult.
Mayor, cities face an acute challenge when it comes to getting an accurate count for a couple reasons, it seems to me. On the one hand, you have the fact of a historical disproportionate undercount of urban populations. Number two, we're talking at a moment when immigration and immigration status is really it's high in people's minds when thinking about, are people going to feel comfortable sharing information about their life with a government that they might not trust? And then finally, you have the homelessness crisis that's striking so many cities, and I feel like counting the homeless population must be a challenge on top of these other urban challenges. So give us a sense of your roadmap to making sure that your city gets a proper count next year.
Sure. It truly is discouraging that politics has infested every aspect of our lives, and the same is true of the census today. So logistically, it's a massive challenge every 10 years, as it is, and this is just an additional hurdle that's been added to it. So, of course, we're concerned about an undercount, but we're even more concerned about a disproportionate undercount of not just urban communities, but certain hard-to-reach communities vis-a-vis suburban and even rural communities. And it really falls on us at the local level, at the city level, at the state level to make sure that we're getting out there. And by this point, every city and state should have their own complete count committee. We should think about this as a campaign. As politicians, we've all run campaigns in the past. We know how to do them. Everything from lawn signs to stickers to go on the radio. I mean, at this point, those are the basics, and we should all be preparing to do that. But it's also important to remember that a top-down approach has its limitations. And when we're talking about hard-to-reach communities, there are communities that are extremely difficult for us to reach, but they're less extremely difficult for other community partners to reach. And so remember that you're not alone in this. We have a lot of willing and able community partners, and they need to be leveraged very smartly to make sure that they're amplifying the message and getting out there, touching people so that they feel comfortable filling it out. Another piece to this is that, yes, the results of this are extremely important for our future, and people get that. People understand that. So if residents are hearing that sufficiently from people that they trust, sometimes from politicians, sometimes not from politicians, I'm optimistic that that message will resonate and we can get folks to fill it out. As we mentioned, we did a full end-to-end test run in Providence. It wasn't fully funded, so we can't truly applaud the results of it. But there are at least two phases of the census count. The first one is where we mail it out and ask people to self-report. As Terri mentioned, this is the first year that we're strongly encouraging folks to fill it out online. And what was encouraging about the test run was that our self-response rate was about what it's been in the past in this first phase of it. So that's definitely encouraging. But then when we moved to the second phase, where people didn't fill it out on their own and we have to send the census workers to knock on doors and to urge people to fill it out, we haven't received the full results of that yet. And that's where I believe that the difficulty of reaching these communities is going to rely on every bit of goodwill that we as politicians or you as community leaders have built up over time to continue to spread the message that, yes, in spite of all the fear and danger that's out there, it is safe to fill this out. You don't have to be concerned. And, that's on top of, yes, the homeless community, children, documented and undocumented immigrants. It's already difficult to reach, so we have to employ every strategy in the book.
Right. We now have all used the word fear in discussing the 2020 census, so I think it's worth being specific about the elephant in the room, which I believe is the citizenship question that the Trump administration wanted to put into the census. Terri Ann, can you just walk us through, give us a kind of cliff notes of what that process was, what the citizenship question was, why the administration wanted to put it in the census, and then how it fared in the legal process?
Sure. Well, we do have to do cliff notes because, as you probably have read, this had a long and sordid history.
Saga.
A saga it is, and I could write a book after I retire. It turns out the administration was sort of cooking up the idea of a citizenship question, and its allies were long before the current president was ever announced that he was running for office. But having said that, a year into this administration, out of the blue, the administration announced that it wanted the Census Bureau to add what we believe was an untested, well, it was untested, but it was also unnecessary question asking about citizenship. This is after the content, the questions on the form, had been locked down in accordance with a timetable set forth in law. And so, sort of chaos ensued. This really took a process that should have been at a final stage in the year ending in 2018, and upended it. It diverted the Census Bureau's attention. There were 3 major lawsuits filed. Cities, of course, led those lawsuits, California, New York, and then one in Maryland. Full disclosure, I was an expert witness in those 2 cases, so there were 6 cases. And long story short, the cases reached the Supreme Court this past spring, and in June, on the last day of this session, last session, to the surprise of many, the Supreme Court said that the administration had not followed the procedures that are needed to add a question to the form, and they kicked it back down to the lower courts, but there was no time left to go back through that process. The census forms were on their way to the printer. So there is no citizenship question, and I think the mayor can speak more directly to this. I think that the damage that chaos and controversy caused has been done.
That's exactly where I want to go. I feel like our courts have said their final word on this issue, but the final word hasn't been said among the public if there still is this residual echoing fear and distrust between the people to be counted and the government that is doing the counting, that there's this fear among many, whether their immigration status is legal or not legal, this fear that they don't want to give up too much information to a government in which they have no trust. So what are you seeing on the ground in terms of the fear of people in Rhode Island and Providence specifically?
Yeah, before I get to that specific point, and if there was one pleasant surprise going through the process was that, yes, the issue has been politicized, but at the local level, when you're working with the federal government, it's with career civil servants, and they're well-meaning, they want to do the right thing. It hasn't been politicized at that level. And so we definitely have good, strong federal partners in this, and that's really important to remember as you go through this process. And remember that we can't do it alone. We need our community partners. We need the ground up as well. So there are a lot of resources that we can marshal to get this right. But yes, I mean, in spite of how difficult it already is to get a complete count, now we have this additional hurdle. And I think the answer to that, it's a social challenge in that people are scared and concerned, and we can't make the mistake of thinking that there's a technical solution to a social problem. There's a social solution to that social problem. And that's why it's so important to leverage every bit of goodwill and strong relationships that you've built up in the community, because folks are still scared, they're still concerned, and they will continue to hear word of mouth that, oh yes, watch out for the census, citizenship question, Donald Trump, etc. And so for every one of those messages that they receive, they need to be bombarded with 10 and 20 messages of, it's important to get this done, there's a firewall, Trump will never get access to this information. If there's one takeaway that I ask everyone to walk away from is that it's not about us repeating it. It's about us repeating it in a way that others will as well, people that are closer to the folks that are living in fear, and having them be the voice that then carries it to the final destination.
If I could just add, I mean, the mayor's absolutely right. It is, the census is planned and carried out by the federal government. It is a federal constitutional responsibility, but it's carried out neighborhood by neighborhood across the country in cities. And that brings up the other challenge we didn't mention quickly, which is the low unemployment rate. The Census Bureau has had and will continue to have trouble recruiting enough local people who, you want people knocking on doors who know the neighborhoods and who can, who have a sense of trust with those communities. And that's going to be a challenge as well. So I think mayors can help get the word out about these job opportunities.
Actually, I hadn't even thought about that because, right, the last census took place when the unemployment rate nationally was, over 9%, touching 10%, and now it's happening in an environment with the lowest unemployment rate in 50 or 60 years. So a very different labor market in which you're hiring these extremely important community leaders to do the door-to-door service in case people don't answer the initial census mailing. You brought up earlier, Terri, and the fact that you're really interested in the intersection between the census and climate change. And we're talking today, as California is dealing with a raft of fires in Los Angeles and Sonoma County, you mentioned also that there are natural disasters you might think of being older or totally in the past, like Hurricane Harvey in Houston, that are still facing recovery. I think a lot of people, even if they're familiar with the census, might not be familiar with the degree to which the census is critical for emergency services at a state-to-state level. Tell us a little bit about that intersection between the climate change and census that you're looking at, not just in 2020, but this is an issue that we're going to face every single decade going forward, it seems.
Yeah, so very quickly, I think there's, I've been trying to raise a red flag about natural disasters in the census for a while, because when there is a natural disaster, and I think they are more frequent now and more disruptive, which is why I'm calling it the census meets climate change, the Census Bureau has to modify its counting procedures. It counts households, right? It goes to homes. And when entire towns are wiped out, but just even communities like Houston, where there are neighborhoods that have not been rebuilt from Hurricane Harvey 2 years ago, now they've been hit again by Tropical Storm Imelda. There are tornadoes, Alabama, Dayton, Ohio. All of these will disrupt the counting process. And so it will be incumbent on mayors, on other local officials to help make sure that the Census Bureau knows where the problem areas are, insists that the Census Bureau modify its procedures, and then make sure that people who have been displaced, and there are many, they can't be counted where they intend to return. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, but they have to be counted somewhere. And it'll be incumbent on local officials to help make sure that happens.
Yeah. All right, well, we've talked about fear and we've talked about climate change. We've talked about homelessness. I do want to end on a moment of optimism, Mayor. I feel like you have communicated both to me privately and on this stage an optimism about your own city's capacity to do the 2020 election and get a complete count. Give us a rah-rah message for the other mayors in this room so that we can all have a successful 2020 count.
So with so many divisive forces in the world, it's important for us to be that force that brings people together. And there's something special about the census. It happens every 10 years. It dates back to our nation's founding. We can rally people around this cause. So that in and of itself fills me with optimism. But we have also had good results in the initial test phase that we ran in Providence. So there's a way to get it done. We can be successful. And community is always looking for some way to contribute and chip in. People always want to feel as though they're part of something bigger than themselves. And I would see this as an opportunity rather than simply focusing on all of the challenges. And to underscore Terri's last point, the census touches everything that we care about, right? This is Bloomberg, so we have to mention data, and we need accurate data to move the needle, to improve the lives of all of our residents, and the census is the foundation of all of that. So this is a massive challenge, but more than anything, it's an opportunity for our communities.
Fantastic. Thank you all, and thanks especially to both of you.